National Broadcasting Company and the Conservation Foundation, in cooperation with the Educational Television and Radio Center, present Survival. The story of man, resources, and civilization. Conducted by Albert Burke. Today's program, In Rich Veins, A New World.
About 2,500 years ago, a famous sea voyage was made by a man named Jason and some 50 men from a place called Thessaly in ancient Greece to what was then called the land of Saonis, where there was a place called Colchis. These men were known as the Argonauts, and they went out on this trip to run down a legend, which we know in our time as part of the ancient Greek myth about the legend of the Golden Fleece. This trip involved a search for a rather remarkable animal. It was a ram, a male sheep, that grew as its coat a fleece of pure gold. According to the legend, the animal was kept in a sacred garden, which was guarded by a sleepless dragon. Jason and his men, the Argonauts, were to get by this dragon in this sacred garden in order to get that ram with the golden fleece. And as the myth goes, Jason was successful in this. He got the ram. But as the myth goes, it wasn't entirely a figment of some ancient Greek writer's imagination. As in the case of many myths, this one had a pretty solid basis of fact to back it up. Oh, not as this particular story has come down to us in our time as a valuable bit of ancient Greek literature, but as a fellow named Strabo, an ancient Greek geographer who lived back about the time of Christ, gives us the probable basis for this story. In his description of Colchis as a place where, and I quote, "The winter torrents bring down gold, which the barbarians collect in wooden troughs, pierced with holes and lined with fleeces," unquote. The fine hairs of the sheep's skin, you see, would catch the grains of gold in water coming down from the mountains of the Caucasus at the eastern end of the Black Sea, over in this part of the world, which was the probable location of Colchis in Strabo's time, as it is today. The skins of animals used for this purpose would be hung in this area on trees to dry, and the gold would then be beaten or shaken out of them, very much as this kind of routine for what we now call placer mining of gold is still carried on in parts of South America today. The legend of the Golden Fleece, you see, could be an early story about mining, about early man's search for and use of minerals in his affairs. Not the earliest such story. The mines of Cassandra in Greece were estimated to have turned out mineral ores like gold and silver, about 2,500 years before the time of Christ. And man's first use of minerals undoubtedly goes back a long way in time, long before the written record of history begins. The use of flint, for example, in Stone Age man's tools can be taken back not just tens of thousands of years, but actually hundreds, probably hundreds of thousands of years. The gold Jason was looking for in running down the Golden Fleece was a more recent addition to man's interest in minerals, because as one of the metals, it comes into human affairs long after things like these were used by early men. According to one expert on early man's use of minerals, these 13 varieties of minerals laid out here were used by men in the period of human history between 100,000 and 7,000 BC. Such items as chalcedony here, and quartz, and serpentine, and obsidian, and pyrite crystals, or steatite, jadeite, calcite, and items like fluorspar. Every one of these items are non-metallic minerals, and they're more or less common stuff to be found on the land in many places around the world. They were accepted and used for whatever early man's purposes may have been in the case of these items. The metals of our time come much later, and the first of these was probably gold taken out of the streams and rivers by early miners much as the early Greek geographer Strabo described this in Colchis, the land of the golden fleece. After gold, we have copper, which introduces the Copper Age. Then a variety of lesser metals are discovered, among them tin, which was used by being mixed with copper to make bronze and so start the Bronze Age. Until one day, somewhere, very recently in time, someone found a way to get iron out of its ore and set down the Iron Age. And with that, the basis for our own civilization, as you and I live it today, was laid down. Because today's industrial civilization sits solidly on iron and on steel. And steel is made by reworking iron to include different amounts of carbon and other minerals to make the different kinds of steel. This stuff, iron, try to think of a way in which this element doesn't affect our lives today. It's used in the machines that makes things, and it's used in the things that are made by machines. Without it, transportation as we know it would be impossible, from the steel rails that we use across the country and the diesel engines on our railroads, through ships and planes and automobiles. It's used in all kinds of construction to make buildings and build bridges and tunnels and towers. It makes our clothes in textile factories. It's used in the agricultural tools that produce our food, and in the machines that handle and package our food. It supplies our water. About the only thing we can say is not affected by this material in our lives is the air we breathe, and even that isn't always true, now that we've got air conditioning. It's really amazing stuff. You might call this the Proteus of metals, because like Proteus, who was one of the gods of ancient Greece, a sea god who could change his appearance whenever he wanted to, this metal can be made to change too, and not just its appearance, but what it can do. It's the most important metal in human affairs for two reasons. One of them is that it can be made to serve so many different purposes. You want a hard iron for something like a file? Well, then you have it in a hard metal like this. You want a soft iron in order to make something like a nail? Well, then you have it in terms of the metal that's used for that purpose. How about a brittle iron for casting? Or perhaps you'd like a springy iron for a variety of reasons. Perhaps even beyond that, you'd like a magnetic iron to do something like this. Iron can serve all these purposes, as no other metal which can be produced as cheaply can do these things. There is no adequate substitute for this stuff, and this has to do with the second reason why it's the most important metal in human affairs, and that is what's shown on this graph here. Here we have a kind of overall view of the Earth, and this band around the outside represents, this little white line represents about 10 miles of the Earth's crust, in which or from which we get the 103 presently known elements that make up the stuff of at least this 10-mile band of Earth on which we live. Only 8 of those 103 elements can be found in that 10-mile thick crust in amounts greater than 1%, and they're listed up here in the proportions indicated: oxygen, silicon, aluminum, iron, sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. When you take this group and add it to the group of elements listed below here, all except the one that's called all others, in the 14 elements listed here, you have about 99.4% of the outer crust of the Earth. And as you can see, iron, the fourth most abundant element in that crust, is exceeded only by one other metal. The only metal that's found there in greater quantity is aluminum, but it's a whale of a lot harder to produce aluminum as a metal from its ore than it is to produce iron as a metal from its ore. There's a lot of this stuff around, iron, and it can be produced cheaply to do many kinds of jobs. Nothing we use in our lives today compares with its importance in our affairs. Now realize what that chart means. Iron may very well be the most important single item in our lives today, but our lives today are not what they are because of iron alone. Our industrial way of life couldn't possibly operate without copper, for example, one of the earliest known and earliest used of the metals. Copper is the basic, most important metal for moving power around. In order to do work as electrical energy, no other metal which costs as little as copper which can be produced as cheaply as copper, can transmit electricity from place to place, as well as this metal. There is a better conductor of electricity. Silver will conduct electricity better, but silver costs too much for this purpose. In the same sense that I suggested a moment ago that we couldn't think of the kind of world we live in without iron, just try to think about the world we live in without copper. To do such things as move electrical power into our homes and into our factories to work machines. But where is copper on the list of minerals that make up more than 99% of the stuff of this crust that we live on? It isn't here. It's included in this less than 1% category of all others in that crust. And this item is important because, unlike iron, there isn't much of this vital metal, copper, around. There isn't much lead around either, on which we depend for making storage batteries, and anti-knock gasoline for our high-compression car motors, and ammunition and paints and a variety of other items. There is no really good substitute for lead in these things, and lead makes up only a tiny fraction of the metals in the Earth's crust, too. There isn't much zinc either, which we use with copper to make brass, and to protect iron and steel against rust by galvanizing, and a wide variety of other uses. In zinc, in lead, and in copper, in the case of all of these, there is no really good substitute to do their work. This list of metals and minerals that we need to make our way of life what it is today, but which is not included in these more plentiful elements that make up most of the Earth's crust, this list could go on to include such things as cobalt. To give you some idea of the importance of cobalt, we would produce far fewer jet aircraft engines for those jet airplanes that we're turning out to defend ourselves and our interests all over the world. We'd produce far fewer without cobalt, and a couple of other items we're not too familiar with, such as columbium, tungsten, nickel, and chromium. The list could go on to include such things as manganese, which we use for making high-quality steels, molybdenum, tin, graphite, vanadium, and the rest of the 90 elements that make up less than 0.7% of the Earth as we know it. These proportions of things in the Earth's crust are important, but while they give us some idea about how much of each of these items there happens to be, the information on that graph tells us very little about how much we can use of each of those items, about how much we can get to meet our needs from place to place around the world. We can't get all these things that are listed here or that I've mentioned from place to place, because while an average section of any part of this 10-mile thick crust would show the proportions as I've given them to you here, that does not mean that those items are available in those proportions from place to place. Now, in order to make this point clear, let's deal with the matter of iron in the Earth's crust, and let's limit this just to the territory of our own United States. Let's deal with the amount of it under our roughly 3 million square miles to a depth no more than 1,000 feet, because few of our producing mines go down even that far. In that 1,000-foot zone, there are approximately around 275,000 billion tons of iron, 275 quadrillion tons of iron. Now, this is a staggering figure, particularly when it's compared with the amount of iron that we've produced in the United States, let's say between the years 1870 and 1950. In that 80-year period, we turned out about 2 billion tons of iron. And with this kind of comparison, there surely would seem to be, no problem of supply of iron for our needs for a long time to come. Yet despite this, we've been talking about shortages of iron for about the last 20 to 25 years. And we're now bringing into the United States iron ore which we mine or which is mined for us in places outside the United States, in places like Canada or Labrador or Venezuela, outside the United States. And we do this because, we say, our own sources of supply are simply no longer good enough. Our own sources of supply have been worked out. Now, in face of 275,000 billion tons of iron ore, what in the world goes on here? Worked out? Let's look into this for a moment. because what goes on here ties in very closely with our future as a strong and powerful and prosperous nation in the world. Our whole way of life, as we went into this earlier, sits solidly on iron and on steel and on a wide variety of other things too, but few of those other things are more important or as important as our dependence on iron and steel. Let's assume for a moment that we could take about 100 tons of rock like this stuff I have here, granite, out of the ground under our feet, and that we could get out of it some of our more important mineral needs. If we could afford the amount of energy that would be needed to run the machines that would crush this rock into a powder and would then separate the different elements that are in it in the proportions that I showed you a moment ago on the graph. If we could do that, we would get out of 100 tons of this representative piece of rock about 8 tons of aluminum, 5 tons of iron, 1,200 tons of titanium, which is being talked about these days as a new wonder metal because it's very light and it's very strong, about 180 pounds of manganese, 70 pounds of chromium, 40 pounds of nickel, 30 pounds of vanadium, which is used in making very strong and tough steel, 20 pounds of copper, 10 pounds of tungsten, 4 pounds of lead, as well as varying amounts of other important items. But the point is, we can't afford the amount of energy that would be needed to do this job. To get these amounts of things out of just plain rock, not by any measure of means yet. We can't even produce the amount of energy that would be needed to do the job of working this kind of source of mineral supplies. Again, not yet, by any measure. We can produce the amount of energy that can get iron out of this kind of supply, though, and this is the kind of iron ore we've worked with in the past to turn out the 2 billion tons of iron that I said earlier we've used between 1870 and the beginning of the 1950s. But iron in this kind of stuff isn't found in the proportions that it's found in granite. This is Mesabi iron ore. It's from one of our main sources of iron supply up in northern Minnesota. Or rather, what was one of our main sources of supply, because Mesabi ores like this are just about worked out. This ore has about 50 to 60% of iron in it, not the 5% of iron found in this piece of granite. This is a high-grade, low-cost source. This is a low-grade, high-cost source. And we built our way of life on this high-grade, not this low-grade material. And there isn't much more of this kind of ore around in the United States to use anymore. And this is where cost comes into the picture again, for iron as it does for every other item that we need and depend on. You see, since 1935, we've been using more and more ores in this country, ores of iron with less than 50 to 60% iron in them. We're down now to the point where we're using ores with an average of 25 to 30% iron in them, ores that have half as much iron by content. Now, the point is, while it has half as much, it costs more than twice as much to produce metal from ores with 25 to 30% iron as it does to produce metal from ores with 50 to 60% iron. As the quality of the ore goes down, the cost of the metal goes up until it's no longer profitable. It's no longer worth using low-quality ores. And so we start talking about shortages. And we begin looking for quality ores, high-quality ores, in other parts of the world, as we have done this. And we begin to import the ores we need to keep us a strong, powerful, and prosperous nation. As we are doing this, and in the process, a very important change in the basis for our way of life takes place as this has happened, but as it's not really understood or really appreciated by many of us. That change is that our strength, our place as the leading power in the world today, our prosperity, our high standard of living, which has placed 2 cars in many garages, several television sets, radios and television and telephones in many homes, everything that we enjoy and take so much and so easily for granted, our way of life today depends on the ores of iron and other items that we bring into this country from the outside places that I've mentioned. The change that's involved here is one that deals with the fact that whereas in the past we could supply many of our own needs. Today, our way of life depends in good part on the resources, on the available resource supplies of other people in other places. Now, two very important things should be clear in this. Two not very well known or understood things. The first of these is that power in the world today depends on who has or who controls minerals. The right quantity, the right quality of minerals that make factories and industrial systems work. And that business of quality explains why the figure I gave you earlier of 275,000 billion tons of iron in 1,000 feet of ground under our feet is a completely meaningless figure. Right now, and there are no startling changes in sight in science to change this, only about 1/100th of 1% of that 275,000 billion tons of iron is usable, mineable iron within reasonable cost. There's more than 80,000 times as much iron in the ground under this country than we can use to live as we do today, because there is a very close tie between high-quality resources and plenty of them and our way of life as a political democracy, believing in and practicing economic ideas like freedom of initiative and individual enterprise, and allowing every one of us a maximum of personal liberties to do much as we please in carrying on our political, social, and economic affairs. There's a very close and a very poorly understood tie between a wide margin of resources and our kind of freedom. People without wide margins of resources can't afford our way of life. And a very close example to us in this is our neighbor across the Atlantic, England. The English once had a very wide margin of resources to use in making them strong, powerful, and prosperous. This was during the last part of the last century and the early part of this 20th century. That country could then afford to allow its people to carry on their affairs, particularly their economic affairs, with as much personal freedom as the world has ever known. That is, as long as the minerals and the ores that made this possible, made it possible for English factories to produce things, were coming in from colonies like India, Canada, Australia, Malaya, Burma, large parts of Africa, as well as from her own supplies at home. But the minerals and ores of these places are no longer available to English factories as cheaply or as easily as they once were. India is now free, and that country has industrial ideas of its own and needs its own minerals and ores. This is true for Australia, Canada, Malaya, and much of the rest of that country's former empire. England's economy is no longer free in the way it once was, because what's left to that country to work with is a much smaller margin of resources, less to work with in satisfying the needs of a growing English population. The loss of English colonies did this, and the cost to England in terms of resources of 2 world wars did this. To make less resources for each person go around, less in terms of what's needed today to keep Englishmen living on today's high living standards, England's economy has gradually become a more and more controlled economy, a planned economy. Too many Americans who do not understand the tie that exists between our way of life and a wide margin of resources have assumed easily and wrongly that England was sold a bill of goods by people like socialists, and worse. To explain the political changes and the economic changes that have been going on in that country, particularly since the end of World War II. But the changes in England are tied to mineral and the resource facts of life at least as much as to any other facts of life. And about the resource facts of life, until very recently, we haven't had much to worry about. Which leads to a second item. A map of the world which would show the distribution of resources would show a very uneven distribution of usable resources that makes today's industrial ways of life possible. Very few people had in the past the right combination of low-cost, high-quality minerals and ores in the right places to build an industrial way of life. China, for example, has great reserves of coal, but not much in the way of good iron ore. India, on the other hand, has quite a good deal of iron ore, but not much good coal. Japan over here has poor reserves of both coal and iron. Brazil, over on the other side of the world, has quite a bit of iron, but poor supplies of coal, and on this story goes. 2 places in the world have the best setups for starting off the industrial way of life and raising it to its present day high levels. The first of these was Europe, Atlantic Europe mainly. It's one of the 3 top industrial centers in the world today. The second place was the United States, and we have long been the most important industrial center in the world, outproducing all others, and also based on a wide margin of resources at home. These were the two best places. On a somewhat poorer basis, Russia has put together a first-rate industrial system too, also based on a wide margin of resources, but many of her resources are located poorly in widely scattered places. These three places are the three centers of industrial power in today's world. And very much of the conflict and the stress and the strain in today's world is the result of these two centers, the United States and the USSR, on opposite sides of the European center, trying to get control of this European center. If Russia were able to control it, that country's ability to produce things of peace and of war would be considerably greater than ours. If we can keep Europe out of the Soviet world, we have a greater ability to produce goods of peace of war than Russia has. But behind all this is the story told by another chart, this one, about what it takes to make each of the industrial centers I showed you a moment operate, where the stuff, the minerals and the ores come from that feed those factories and make for power and prosperity in our time. This much is clear by what you see here. The Europeans and the Americans depend on resource supplies of the world by sea lanes, as this is outlined here. They can be cut, they can be broken in time of war simply by sinking the ships that carry minerals and ores to European and American factories. Europe would be a third-rate industrial place quickly without those resource supplies from widely scattered places, and we would suffer heavily too. And so the resource facts of life have Americans and Europeans concentrating on ways to control the seas and the air over them in order to protect the resource lifelines that feed them around the world. Russia's resource supplies, on the other hand, come by land, and explains why Russia concentrates on large land armies and control of the air over them. In the ways that I've pointed out here, and many, many other ways, the mineral and the resource facts of life, as you can see, have a strong influence on the affairs of men. Those of you who followed this series will know that the manner in which these programs have been presented has changed quite a bit from time to time. This was done deliberately in order to find out what form of presentation of educational material would best hold the interest of a viewing audience. There is a place for programs that feed the mind as well as the ears and the eyes. And we would like to know the extent to which we've been successful in doing this. We'd like very much to hear from you about this. Which of the various kinds of presentations that we've given you here has done this best? Let us hear from you.
Albert Burke would like you to address your comments to Survival, Post Office Box 450, Radio City Station, New York 19, New York. The address again, Post Office Box 450, Radio City Station, New York 19, New York. Survival. The story of man, resources, and civilization. In cooperation with the Educational Television and Radio Center. This has been an NBC production. This is National Educational Television.